Hello, welcome back to my course on sustainable land management. Please check the introduction to our first class where I told you about the course, I explained about the references and the glossary, and I introduced myself. In our first three classes, we have covered the topics of land degradation, SLM in humid and urban areas, and SLM in dry zones. Now we'll look at biodiversity and ecosystems. So today we will examine concepts and importance of biodiversity, or biological diversity to give it its full name. We will discuss how it is measured. Agrobiodiversity is then considered as a specific form of biodiversity. Invasive alien species are covered, and then there is a story from Mexico about conservation and livelihoods. And finally the focus is how SLM can contribute to ecosystem restoration. Rachel will present today's class, and while her contribution to its preparation has been significant, I accept full responsibility for the content.
Hello, I'm Rachel Friesen, with a bachelor's degree in sociology as well as in translational and molecular medicine, master's degree in agricultural economics, and currently studying neuroscience. William and I have collaborated online over the past 2 years on this updated version of his course, driven by our shared passion for the environment and deep concerns about our planet's future. This summer of 2023, I traveled to Scotland to meet William in person and put the final touches to this course. I'm going to be presenting his module on biodiversity. Our planet's survival depends on biodiversity, and biodiversity everywhere is under threat. I picked up a magazine in Toronto, Canada before boarding the plane. It's undebatable that our changing environment, especially a hotter climate, will severely impact biodiversity. Our aim in this course is to provide a clear picture of the challenges, but to balance this with plenty of SLM solutions that we hope can be adopted and amplified worldwide. So let's get started on this journey together. The Convention on Biological Diversity, or CBD, was set up in 1993. Over the years, various platforms, deals, and frameworks have been established. All of them have been very ambitious. Conferences of Parties, or COPs for short, are held regularly for each major UN convention. The most recent COP on biodiversity took place in late 2022, in Montreal, near my home in Canada. It resulted in the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework with a new set of targets. These targets cover all ecosystems. In this class, as in the overall course, we will learn more about UN Convention targets and find practical ways to help achieve them through sustainable land management. So we've all heard of biodiversity and that it needs protection. But what is biodiversity? Biodiversity is the variety of plant and animal species, including microorganisms, present in a particular ecosystem. This can be broken into 3 dimensions: richness, abundance, and evenness. Richness refers to the different kinds of species present. Abundance covers their numbers, and evenness refers to the relative distribution of species within the ecosystem. All of these are measured both above and below the ground. The popular perception of biodiversity often centers around large, colorful, exotic, and endangered animals, sometimes called charismatic megafauna. But this narrow focus is misleading. It diverts attention from the crucial aspects of biodiversity underpinning the health of all ecosystems. Biodiversity loss encompasses far more than the animals we see. Remember, biodiversity includes microorganisms. And microorganisms in the soil are a vital part of the life support system of our planet. They, together with all biodiversity, are nourished by sustainable land management. Of course, charismatic megafauna are an important part of biodiversity, so let's look at one example. Like the giant pandas in China, mountain gorillas are another well-known endangered species. These magnificent creatures inhabit the mountains of East and Central Africa, but they face numerous threats. Despite efforts to protect and conserve the habitats of mountain gorillas, their long-term survival remains uncertain. This photo from southwest Uganda shows a clear divide between farmland and a reserve still holding its original montane forest. This striking contrast highlights the impact of human activity on natural habitats and underscores the need to balance land use and conservation. Since the early 2000s, conservation programs have shown a positive impact on gorilla populations. Numbers have risen. This is an encouraging trend. Let's move now to one of the most crucial parts of biodiversity, tropical rainforests. These contain the highest levels of biodiversity of all ecosystems on Earth. We discussed this in Class 1 and pointed out that tropical rainforest destruction is what impacts global biodiversity the most. So tropical rainforests are a top priority for protection. And in the sea, coral reefs are the most biologically diverse ecosystem. But they are facing severe threats from climate change and pollution from river estuaries, the places where rivers empty into the sea. The photo shown here was taken from an airplane flying over the Solomon Islands. Now, whenever biodiversity declines in any way, there is a damaging impact on ecosystem function and the services that ecosystems provide. There are essentially four main categories of ecosystem services. First, supporting services. For example, soil formation, which provide the foundation for ecosystems to deliver other services. Second, provisioning services, which involve the production of resources like food and fiber directly benefiting people. Third, regulating services, such as hydrology regulation, which help control and manage various natural processes within ecosystems. And fourth, cultural services, which encompass aesthetic and recreational benefits that contribute to our cultural and emotional well-being. Biodiversity loss has several harmful impacts, highlighted by the three main reasons shown here at the top. But the loss of agrobiodiversity, or agricultural biodiversity, is a particular concern. The genetic diversity of agricultural crops has plummeted, with Jules Pretty in 1995 noting a 75% loss in genetic diversity over the previous century. It's important to note that agrobiodiversity is a complex concept encompassing both the visible and the subterranean biodiversity within agricultural systems, and both are affected by land degradation. In a previous class, we explored the interrelationship between biodiversity, ecosystems, and land degradation. The Millennium Ecosystem Assessment incorporated all of these elements into their definition of land degradation. The case of the Nile perch provides an excellent illustration of how complex it can be to assess ecosystem functions and services. This predatory fish was introduced to Lake Victoria in the 1950s, and it immediately led to a decrease in the population of numerous indigenous species. But the Nile perch has also become a significant food source for hundreds of thousands of people. It's even exported as Lake Victoria's bounty. Although it is an invasive species, paradoxically, it is beneficial to some. Now, you're probably familiar with the main drivers of biodiversity loss, but the last one on this list may be unfamiliar. Nitrogen is a byproduct of both industry and agriculture. Soluble nitrogen that is deposited in rainfall tends to promote the growth of aggressive plant species, particularly grasses, and these can outcompete and displace other species. Sustainable land management is essential to prevent loss of biodiversity on land. This can be achieved through direct actions such as preventing deforestation and by promoting eco-friendly agriculture. Trees must be protected from logging, but it's also important to safeguard seedlings from browsing by animals by using fences or through community conservation practices. Prevention of biodiversity loss can also be accomplished through indirect measures, including reducing industrial nitrogen emissions and limiting the excessive use of nitrogen fertilizers. We've explored key concepts of biodiversity, the conventions set up to protect it, why losing biodiversity matters, some of the biggest threats, and what can be done to protect it. Now, let's see how we can measure biodiversity. Assessing biodiversity is a huge challenge. It raises the question of what factors to consider. Remember, biodiversity has three components: richness or variety of species, abundance or quantity, and evenness or distribution within a defined area. And this makes biodiversity a complex puzzle to solve. To illustrate, here's an image of gelada baboons. These are grass-eating primates that live in the Simien Mountains of Ethiopia. The baboons here meet one of the criteria for biodiversity. They are abundant. But alone, they obviously do not represent a rich variety of animal species. And of course, there is also not evenness of the numbers of animal species shown here. Well, there are ibex present in this region of Ethiopia, so let's include one in the picture. So now the richness or variety of species is immediately increased. If we bring in a large number of ibex, we also increase the overall abundance of animals. And what's more, the evenness or spread is increased between the species. Different biodiversity indices prioritize different aspects. For example, the Shannon Index highlights species richness, but the Simpson Index is more attuned to the evenness of species. Choosing the appropriate index depends on the specific context and objectives. One increasingly popular method for measuring biodiversity is the Biodiversity Intactness Index, BII. It is relatively simple to compute and tracks changes in biodiversity over time. Although it may seem simplistic, it has become the most commonly used general tool and provides countries with a way to report back to the UNCBD on their progress in meeting targets. So, we've covered key concepts of biodiversity and some methods of measuring it. We also brought up how the loss of agrobiodiversity or agricultural biodiversity is a particular concern. Let's explore this. Well, let's look first at the concept of eco-agriculture. This refers to land use systems that are aimed at producing both food and ecosystem services, and they include habitat for wild biodiversity. Eco-agriculture emphasizes the sharing of land between farming and nature. However, there is a counter-argument. It suggests sparing land for nature while greatly intensifying agriculture may be a better approach. Sparing means highly intensified production, like this polytunnel where the environment is closely controlled. Production is maximized per unit area, and natural landscapes can revert to nature. But the reality is that most existing farming systems worldwide need to share their land with nature. And that's what we'll focus on now. Considering agriculture's dominance over 1/3 of the Earth's terrestrial surface, the significance of biodiversity within agricultural lands cannot be overstated. As discussed in Class 2, activities such as deforestation severely impact biodiversity, yet SLM practices hold the potential to rejuvenate agricultural biodiversity, including that within the soil. There are two key elements to agrobiodiversity that need to be considered: management of farming systems, and diversity of crops and livestock. I like to think of it this way. Just imagine a play performed in a theater. There's a director, and there are actors. Well, agrobiodiversity is similar. The manager directs what is done in the agricultural theater and holds huge influence, even though the acting cast of crops and livestock gain most of our attention. Key management decisions can be divided into farming practices and protection of natural biodiversity within the theater of the farming system. Diversity of farmed species, on the other hand, covers crop varieties and livestock breeds, and these are the main actors on the stage. To begin, let's discuss management practices, such as planting mixed crops, as seen in Tanzania. Or, for another example, intercropping coconut and cacao, as observed in Papua New Guinea. In fact, these two crops are commonly grown together and have their own extension branch. Okay, we have actually discussed a variety of in-field practices before, in Class 2. Here's a look at some of them again as a reminder: intercropping, crop rotation, mulching, and so on. Moreover, management includes maintaining indigenous biodiversity within agricultural systems, integrating features like hedges in the UK or ditches in the Netherlands, and preserving woodland patches where cultivation is impractical. Trees in clusters are a common sight in many landscapes, marking areas where the land is too rocky for plowing or where ancient trees have been preserved. These islands of trees serve as refuges for natural diversity within the cultivated landscape. Turning to the leading characters, the crops and livestock, we must remember that their selection also is a strategic managerial decision. This category includes the entire spectrum of farmed livestock species and all varieties and land races of crops. To monitor crop diversity, the FAO has initiated a comprehensive global inventory. Moreover, a seed vault has been established in Norway to safeguard these genetic resources. Let's take a look at some examples of the rich biodiversity around the world. First of all, examples of common crops. Beginning with cereal crops, we have rice, which hails from Asia. In this image from Nepal, we see various types of rice being cultivated within a single field. Moving on to maize or corn, which originates from Mexico, we find it available in numerous varieties, including hybrid and genetically modified strains like BT maize, designed for pest resistance. Wheat, with its multiple varieties, traces its roots to the Fertile Crescent in the Middle East, a cradle of early agriculture. Then there's Aragrostis teff, or simply teff, predominantly grown in Ethiopia, with the United States emerging as the second largest producer of teff, catering primarily to the Ethiopian diaspora. Injera, a sour pancake that is a staple in Ethiopian cuisine, is made from fermented teff. Pearl millet, a staple in West Africa, is primarily cultivated in arid regions. Very little selective breeding work has been carried out on this plant because it is mainly grown for subsistence and not for the market. It will likely become more important with drier conditions brought by climate change. Although finger millet is originally from Africa, it is mostly cultivated in India. This image shows finger millet in the foothills of the Himalayas. Sorghum, another African cereal, is significant for food security, but it is also well adapted to climate change due to three of its characteristics. Firstly, it is resistant to drought. Secondly, it can withstand waterlogging. And finally, it can retune. That means that even if it is harvested, It can grow back and produce a new crop in response to rain. In the event of a failed crop, it can be cut back and used as feed for livestock, and may even still produce a ratoon harvest. Turning now to coffee, it is indigenous to Ethiopia, thriving as an understory plant in forests below the main canopy, as seen here close to Lake Tana. Coffee plantations are often shaded, mimicking this natural habitat. Lastly, cowpeas, originating likely from West Africa, are critical legumes with an inherent drought resistance and a short growth cycle, enabling them to survive in challenging conditions. Notably, both the leaves and seeds are edible. The diversity within agriculture extends to livestock as well. For instance, Bos indicus cattle, native to tropical regions, exhibit resilience against tick-borne diseases that often afflict Bos taurus cattle imported from Europe. An excellent example of such hardiness is the Ankoli breed from western Uganda, known for their impressive horns and adaptability. In Europe, Bos taurus are at home, and here are Highland cattle grazing in Scotland's mountains. This is what they were bred to do back in the 1800s. Their foraging habits help to maintain healthy, biodiverse grasslands. Frisian cattle are a dairy breed, originally from the Netherlands. Here, a herd is being raised in South Africa, and the farmer is pointing out that inbreeding is a problem due to the low numbers and lack of diversity in the area. It's essential to have a biodiverse gene pool in order to maintain a healthy herd. And here's a Frisian cow in England. Changes in agricultural practices over the last 50 years reflect a shift in understanding. Past advice favored highly fertilized, strip-grazed pastures to maximize productivity. But these pastures relied on monoculture, supporting only one type of grass. Today, in places like North America, the trend is towards rotational grazing methods such as adaptive multi-paddock grazing, which enhance biodiversity and improve carbon sequestration in the soil. Efforts to revitalize European grasslands are moving towards re-establishing rich biodiversity. Traditional hay meadows, which support a multitude of grass species and wildflowers, are just one example of these efforts, contributing significantly to ecological health and stability. Turning our attention to Uganda, we find a unique statistic. The country has the world's highest banana-to-person ratio. At first glance, banana plantations may appear to be examples of monoculture. However, a closer inspection often reveals a complex system of intercropping, resulting in a robust level of biodiversity within these plantations. Diversity is even more pronounced in crops cultivated near homes. This is partially because of the greater availability of water, as well as nutrients from household waste and animal manure. It's certainly the case for Rose in Uganda, who cultivates an impressive array of 35 edible crop species in her homestead. Medicinal plants are another vital component of biodiversity. Many wild plants are revered for their curative properties, and it is likely that numerous others remain to be discovered. One notable species is the devil's claw from southern Africa, currently exported to Europe for its effectiveness in treating arthritis. Another significant plant is Artemisia. Long valued in Chinese medicine, its adoption in African agriculture is relatively new. When used in conjunction with other treatments, Artemisia has proven to be a potent component in the fight against malaria. Now, we've seen examples of agrobiodiversity and how crops may be brought in from other countries and cultivated for their nutritional or medicinal value. But sometimes new plants can be harmful. We will look at some examples of this next. Well, we just discussed agrobiodiversity and how some plants like Artemisia can be considered a welcome foreigner. But the introduction of other invasive alien plant species poses a significant threat to biodiversity, and often to water supplies as well. These other plants were often brought in for commercial purposes or simply as ornaments. This photo, captured at the equator in Uganda, highlights two of Africa's most problematic invasive species, Opuntia, also known as the prickly pear cactus, and lantana, a commonly used decorative shrub. Here are 4 well-known examples of invasive species that can rapidly outcompete native vegetation: Opuntia and lantana, which we have just seen, Prosopis, which we discussed in the previous class, and black wattle, a tree from Australia. Opuntia, which is the name for various species of cactus, including the prickly pear, has become invasive in many parts of Africa and is also widespread in Australia. Although it produces edible fruit, it's generally more harmful than beneficial. Lantana camara is a decorative shrub with attractive flowers, but it is generally not very useful. Birds distribute its seeds, and it is considered a threat in many tropical regions because it tends to displace more valuable species. In this photo, a Kenyan farmer has been creative and managed it as a hedge. Now, in our previous class, we discussed Prosopis and how planting it without proper consideration can be detrimental. While Prosopis cineraria is a beneficial agroforestry tree in India, Prosopis juliflora, which thrives in dry areas, can quickly become invasive and form impenetrable, thorny thickets. The response to those who claim that trees are good should, unfortunately, be not in every situation. Black wattle is a type of thornless acacia from Australia. Plantations of wattle in East and South Africa have led to a problem of wild seedlings colonizing the banks of watercourses. However, in some areas of Africa, local communities have found creative solutions. For example, in Uganda, wattle is cut for charcoal, and in South Africa, a community has turned an invasive patch of wattle into a productive plantation of timber. Now that we've covered examples of biodiversity and the way that people can interact with various plants to harness their potential, let's move on to a story. William had a master's student in Amsterdam named Mariana. She was proud that the monarch butterfly hibernated near her hometown in Mexico. But she had concerns about the conflict between the nature reserve created and the local community's livelihoods. As we see in this quote, the debate over poverty and conservation is contested between those who believe that conservation should also address poverty issues and those who do not. Mariana applied participatory skills learned during her course to engage with the local community in her fieldwork. She asked for their opinions on the nature reserve and on ecotourism. She presented the results of her research at a conference in Oaxaca, Mexico. In summary, protecting biodiversity is crucial, but when it comes at the expense of people's well-being, then ultimately conservation efforts may be undermined. For conservation to succeed, it's essential to consider both local and global concerns. We're nearing the end of the class. Let's conclude with ecosystems. William helped to write a publication in 2021 for the launch of the UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration. The aim of the document, a collaborative effort between the UNCCD and WOCAT, was to demonstrate how sustainable land management can benefit each of the world's 8 main ecosystems listed here. This is important because, as we've discussed, the health of the planet relies on functional ecosystems, which in turn depend on biodiversity. Let's start with farmlands, which cover more than a third of the world's surface. Farmland is often sloping and left bare after harvest. What's more, biodiversity is reduced compared with the original forest or grassland. So, farmlands are among the most vulnerable of all ecosystems. Improving agrobiodiversity is essential to restore farmlands, and regenerative agriculture through sustainable land management plays a significant role in achieving this. There are a broad range of SLM options that have developed over time to meet farmers' needs, including both traditional and innovative methods. Okay, our next type of ecosystem is grasslands, shrublands, and savannas. These cover around a quarter of the world's land. These ecosystems are generally found in drier regions, and they support fewer people directly than can be supported by farmland ecosystems. They are diverse and unique, but also prone to desertification. Land tenure, invasive species, and the use of fire are significant issues. Forests play a crucial role for various reasons, and as you are aware, they are not all equal. Tropical rainforests in particular are vital for the well-being of the planet. Forests cover approximately 30% of the world's surface, of which only about 1/3 is in good condition. Tropical rainforests are the most biodiverse terrestrial ecosystem globally, and in Class 1, we learned about deforestation and restoration efforts. Mountainscapes are mosaics with special characteristics, consisting of a mix of croplands, grasslands, forests, and settlements. But, due to steep slopes, they are prone to severe erosion and mass wasting. Mountains have unique biodiversity, especially at high altitudes, and they act as water towers, feeding the headwaters of rivers. And because of their mixed land use, there are a wide range of potential SLM remedies available. Freshwater ecosystems are not just lakes and wetlands. There are river systems flowing through all kinds of other ecosystems, from mountains to lakes, wetlands, and usually onto the sea. Managing these ecosystems requires a tailored approach. Both water quality and quantity are crucial. Unfortunately, freshwater ecosystems are vulnerable to pollution and changes in land use. Protective riparian forest strips are under threat everywhere. Freshwater species have seen a greater decline since 1970 than marine or terrestrial species. Urban ecosystems might seem like a strange concept, but given that they house over half the world's population on a relatively small land area, it's crucial to keep them healthy. These ecosystems are constructed, and they have unique biodiversity. But they are highly vulnerable to degradation from land pollution, waste, and poor air quality. To address these issues, urban agriculture and creating blue corridors of water and green corridors of trees, parks, and gardens can help. These provide habitat for wildlife and improve the quality of life for urban residents. Peatlands cover only about 3% of the world's surface. Despite this, they hold twice as much carbon as forests. This highlights the absolute importance of protecting peatlands. There's a strong concentration of peatlands in the northern zones. Canada, where I'm from, has 25% of the world's peatlands. And it's astonishing to realize that 1 square meter of deep peatland may hold up to 5 times the amount of carbon found in 1 square meter of Amazon rainforest. Healthy peatlands are active. They continue to sequester vast amounts of carbon every year. But because of degradation, there is currently a net loss of carbon. The biggest threat is drainage. When water is removed, peatlands start to decompose and release carbon dioxide. Climate change, in turn, will trigger more wild peat fires with huge extra greenhouse gas emissions. In summary, peatlands are becoming more vulnerable to human activities and the impacts of climate change. They urgently deserve more attention. To protect and restore peatlands, measures like rewetting and sustainable farming practices, that is, polludiculture, can be implemented. And finally, oceans and coasts are included in SLM concerns. This is because inland activities affect the sea and coastal strip, with its dunes, coastal forests, and mangroves. Good SLM practices inland can also positively impact the coast and ocean. A ridge-to-reef approach ensures continuous SLM from mountains to the coast. Mangrove forests are a special focus as they are rich ecosystems threatened by pollution and deforestation. Remedies include exclusion, resting, and replanting.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Rachel. And finally, a summary of take-home messages as usual. We hope you've been stimulated by the class today and have realised how important biodiversity and ecosystems are. Next time, we'll move on to SLM and water, another wide-ranging topic. Until then, thanks a lot from both of us. Bye for now.